From Community Public Radio, this is the CPR News. From New York, I'm Don DeBar. Today we go to Moscow to speak with Mark Sloboda, an analyst that sometimes lectures at Moscow State University. Is former naval officer, former U.S. Navy guy, and he's an American living in Moscow. And we're going to get an update on the stuff around Ukraine that we were talking about last week. Mark, if you want to pick up where we left off and bring us up to date.
Great. Don, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on CPR.
And likewise.
Okay. Well, the situation in Ukraine continues to gather tension. The West, the U.S., continues to scream about an imminent Russian invasion of Ukraine. That hasn't changed. U.S. diplomats are being pulled out of Ukraine and out of Belarus, because Belarus in particular, because first of all, they have the U.S. and Belarus do not exactly have good relations right now, and second of all, because Russian troops are also gathering in Belarus, basically along the northern border of Ukraine, as well as the eastern border with Russia. The Zelensky regime in Kiev evidently is having a bit of a row with Washington. The word from Zelensky is that he knows better what is happening, that there is no threat of an imminent invasion of any sort by Russia. And that the Russian force level, at least directly on the Ukrainian border, has not effectively changed much since 2014. He is upset that the panic, as he calls it, the hysteria being created by Western media and governments, is destabilizing Ukraine, creating panic there. Including economic crisis, problems with the currency, and foreign investment leaving the country, and all kinds of economic damage, panic buying, and the sort. It is generally assumed by analysts that Zelensky is afraid that the U.S. is hyping up the possibility of a Russian intervention in Ukraine in order to pressure him to fulfill the Minsk Accords, which the regime in Kiev has no intention of ever doing so. And directly to that point, the head of the Kiev regime National Security Council spoke to the press in the last few days. Alexei Danilov, who was once heavily involved in racketeering in Ukraine back in the 1990s. And speaking to the press, he said that the fulfillment of the Minsk agreement, again, an agreement that has been agreed by everyone and still receives lip service, that is the only way out of the crisis, it is enshrined in international law by a UN Security Council resolution, which the U.S. and France and Germany all agreed to, and Kiev signed on the line. And it is a political reconciliation between the regime in Kiev, backed by the U.S., and the Donbas republics, backed by Russia, to politically reconcile from the events of 2014, when the last legitimate democratically elected government of the whole country was overthrown by an openly U.S.-backed, violent, and unconstitutional putsch. And the Minsk agreements are supposed to politically reconcile the two terms of the country. However, they have sat unfulfilled since 2015 because Kiev has taken not even the most basic steps necessary to do so. is to even sit down and talk with the political leaders of the Donbass, whom they refer to everyone in the Donbass as terrorists. In fact, they declared it an anti-terrorist operation, or pro-Russian separatists, as it's usually dehumanized. But they refuse to sit down and talk. They refuse an amnesty. They refuse the federalization that would be required to be passed through the Rada, which seems pretty much like a political impossibility considering the hyper-nationalist makeup of the Rada these days from the Kiev regime. So it has stalled, and that is one of Russia's primary concerns, is that they see that everyone is paying lip service to the Minsk Accords, but no one is actually fulfilling it, while the de facto NATOization, the increasing military presence of NATO on the ground in Ukraine continues and continues. And Danilov said, the fulfillment of the Minsk agreement means the country's destruction. And then he went on to say, if they insist on talking about the West, he said, if they insist on the fulfillment of the Minsk agreements, and he says, if the society doesn't accept those agreements, it could lead to a very difficult internal situation, and Russia counts on that. Well, it's a rather interesting statement, if the society doesn't accept these agreements, because the polls in Ukraine, Zelensky was actually elected on the fact that the promise that he would bring peace to the country. Of course, he's done the exact opposite, and his 75% approval rating has crashed down into the low 20s, 20% approval as a result of that. But polls in the Ukraine clearly show that a majority of Ukrainian people want peace, right? And they are largely on board with the Minsk Accord. So who exactly is he talking about, and why is it dangerous? Of course, what he is talking about is the far right ultranationals, Banderite militias that are now, they have political movements. They still have the coherent militias that are separate paramilitary units, but they are also, we're talking Azov, Right Sector, C-14, and others.
Much better armed now, though, right? They're much better armed now than they were when they
much better armed.
Power.
Well, they're government salary. They're integrated into the police, the military, the security services.
That's right.
The National Guard is almost entirely composed of them. And they are also spread throughout the mainstream Maidan political parties. All right. Andrei Parubi, head neo-Nazi in Ukraine. He was literally the founder of the reverse named Social Nationalist Party of Ukraine. Not too long ago, and then he was involved with Svoboda. The guy is a complete unrepentant. It's a misnomer to refer to Parubi as a neo-Nazi, because he's more of an old school, Banderite fascist Nazi, right?
Listen, just one other thing. I just want to clarify for people, to correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not unfair to say essentially that these militias serve the same purpose and most likely are really strong adherents ideologically to the SS, the role that they played in Germany in the 1930s and early 40s.
I would say more the brown shirts at this point, although they're certainly on the way to becoming the full official SS. They're definitely on their way there. They have integrated so far. Parubi is the number 2 person on Poroshenko, the previous president, the candy oligarch president of Ukraine, his so-called European Solidarity Party. And he was Speaker of the Rada up until of the Putsch Rada up until a couple of years ago. This is when the Ukrainian military fell apart, defected, or refused to fight in the Donbass, when they were met with crowds of people saying, "What are you doing here?" Right? And largely turned around or defected or were disbanded. It was these far right battalions that were sent to launch this punitive campaign to try to force the people of the Donbass to accept the overthrow of the government in Kiev. And that has snowballed. Eventually, the Kiev regime purged the military, what was left of it, got control of it, and their response to, being greeted with protesters was to simply sit outside the cities and start lobbing artillery shells and airstrikes in. Right. That led to, the initial conflicts, which ended badly for Kiev. And it's largely presented in the West as if the Russian military crossed the border on the Donbass and defeated the Ukrainian military. That is completely false.
Right.
Russia did provide funding and arms and training for the self-defense forces, the militias of the Donbass, just like NATO was doing and has done for the regime in Kiev.
And humanitarian aid, by the way, because the West had, the Kiev government basically cut off all kinds of regular supplies, food, and whatever that normally came from the West. And there was humanitarian aid from Russia, lots of it, as a matter of fact, was
the blockade of the economic blockade of Donbass itself, a war crime, continues to this day. So these battalions are the ones who did the fighting in the initial phases. They were defeated largely because a not insignificant portion of the Donbass militias was military, police, and security forces, particularly from East Ukraine, that defected, that said, we don't agree with what happened in Kiev. That's not our government. We didn't elect them. They seized power. We're done with that, right? And that is the frozen conflict that continues to this day. And it is true that the regime in Kiev agreed to the Minsk agreements in that bad military position of having its forces defeated twice in the Donbass, whatever they may say, by locals in the early days of the conflict in late 2014. In 2015, they did agree to it under pressure. But now that they have purged and rebuilt their military along their own lines with people like this Alexei Danilov in charge, of course, now they say they have no intention of fulfilling the Minsk obligations, despite it being backed by Western countries, at least rhetorically, and enshrined in the UN Security Council. And Danilov went on to say during this diatribe he delivered, where he said, he talked. Why would this lead to the instability of the country with the Minsk Accords? Of course, because the far right and the ultranationalists, these band-right fascists, they would not accept the Minsk Accords, right? Because they would not accept the political reconciliation of the country. As far as they're concerned, the only way that the people of East Ukraine, Donbass, could be reintegrated into Ukraine is in complete subjugation and political repression, because their pro-Russian views, or not anti-Russian views anyway, are not acceptable in the new Ukraine.
Right. This is exactly what they did at the time of the coup. Yanukovych had negotiated a deal with members of the EU and who basically said the opposition and the government will sit down and here's a deal. We're going to share power. We're going to do this. And while that was happening, and when that agreement was struck, and the West was supposed to be a guarantor to it, these people stormed the buildings, and Yanukovych had to escape with his life and his family's life, and they took power despite having an agreement to the contrary. So
sure, yeah, now that was the February 21st agreement.
Yeah, so why would you expect any different?
Whereby Yanukovych stood down all of the police in Kiev, which resulted in a night where they just seized control of the Rada, and then they stormed the presidential administration just hours with very little resistance, because the police were stood down, because Yanukovych, naive, willing to believe France and Germany at the very least, thought that a power sharing agreement was the result, between the leaders of the Maidan and the existing government. At least, until the next election scheduled for 2015. But what he got was, when the police stood down, the far right, took over, and then he fled the country because, the people that had just killed dozens of police and injured hundreds, and seized control of the country. These nascent battalions headed by Perubi, we're seizing control of the country.
Why has that guy got a rope in his hand? Who's that for, I wonder? And not for nothing. This is not antithetical, okay, or antithetical to the situation that we have now, where Russia's seeing this crazy stuff and seeing NATO coming up to its border now, puts troops on its own border, as basically a defensive wall, and the West is saying, remove them. Stand them down, and we'll stand our guys down. The Russians have got to be looking at it like, you must be crazy.
Yeah, well, of course, Russia is saying the U.S. is putting troops, in Eastern Europe. According to the Russian Foreign Ministry, there are some 10,000 NATO trainers and advisors, quote unquote, in Ukraine. But Russia. They have had, cycling of buildups, particularly to deter the regime in Kiev from returning to offensive operations, at least large scale, over the past few years. However, I think there are good reasons to believe that this military buildup is substantially different, and that Russia, and announcing clearly that their red lines have been crossed and unable to achieve the security guarantees that they sought from the U.S. and NATO, and also meaning that the U.S. is and the other NATO states are completely unwilling to force their client regime to fulfill the Minsk Accords, and the frozen conflict with the shelling and the economic blockade and the misery continues in the Donbass, then that they may they've talked of military technical measures to achieve their own security, basically saying all options are on the table. And at this point, a Russian intervention in Ukraine is not firmly decided on, but is definitely one of those options that the Russian military has put into play. Not by the massing of large numbers of troops directly on the Ukrainian border, but by changing their force posture in Western Russia, and basically creating logistical centers, staging grounds where several hundred kilometers back from Ukraine, where large amounts of military equipment, supplies, everything have essentially been pre-positioned, ready for troops from elsewhere in the country to come on what could be relatively short notice. We're still talking a week, right, at least. If there is going to be a Russian intervention in Ukraine, and that is only one of the options, again, I don't believe that anything has been decided on. There are other lesser options. But if that is decided on, I would take a look towards the end of February, after the Olympics. Russia certainly would try to avoid disrupting the Olympics of their strategic partner and de facto ally, China, if they can avoid it, if they can safely avoid it. But I mean, this situation they see continues. I mean, before this crisis, Russian was the daily language of actually at least half, if not the majority, of Ukrainians. And the language has effectively been driven completely from the public sphere. I mean, it's been driven out of the media. It's been driven out of the print press. It's been driven off of TV, the government services. And, it's gone further. If you are a waiter at a restaurant, right, anywhere in the country, even in the Russian-speaking East, and if you reply to your customers in Russian without getting their approval, you can actually be fined and possibly go to jail. That's how ridiculous it is.
Can I ask you a question? Because you speak both, right? Your wife is
my wife speaks both. I do not speak Ukrainian.
So let me ask you this question. My Russian, I have maybe a vocabulary of 2-3 dozen words, and a general understanding of basic grammar and declension conjugation rules, and I can read the alphabet, sight read, that I got. So to me, having been in Moscow and having been in Kiev, with the exception of 1 or 2 letters, I don't see much of a difference. I'm sure there are differences in spoken, but my guess, and I probably shouldn't have said, but I've said several times for people here to understand, you're talking about like the difference between, say, New Orleans patois or something, and L.A. slang. In terms of difference. No, it's a greater difference?
It's more substantial than that. It's more substantial than that. I can understand generally somewhere between 30 and 40%.
Oh, really? It's that different.
When I hear. Ukrainian is often, and I think not entirely incorrectly, described as a, half Russian with about 30% Polish and a little bit of else thrown into the mix.
Yeah.
It is something that generally Russian and Ukrainian speakers. First of all, almost all Ukrainians speak Russian. That's
Soviet legacy, right? History.
Yeah. So not just the Soviet legacy. I mean, they up until 2014 they were taught Russian in schools, and it has to be said that my wife, for instance, from the Crimea, which is entirely Russian speaking, even in the Soviet Union, she was forced to learn Ukrainian at school.
Right.
So it's not like the Soviet Union was repressing the Ukrainian language in any way, shape, or form.
Right.
She did not like to learn Ukrainian. I don't myself. I don't consider it a bad thing that she had to learn it.
Right.
Technically, Crimea was because of Khrushchev transmitted at the time to Ukraine,
right.
And I don't think it hurts anyone in the Soviet Union to speak Russian and Ukrainian and possibly a few other Soviet state republic languages like Kazakh or something like that. But anyway, it's not like the Soviet Union was repressing Ukrainian. And This Alexei Danilov, this Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council, he went on to say that the use of the Russian language itself in the world is unsafe.
Whoa.
Yeah. Now, of course, he was giving this interview in Russian. The irony,
come on.
This is the insanity of the regime in Kiev on top of all of this. But because Russian language might lead to sympathy with Russia or pro-Russian ideas, and that's treason in the Ukraine. Because an idea of a Ukraine that has a foreign policy that does not see Russia as the enemy, that's verboten now. Right. That is treason. Right?
Is that a German word?
That's almost as bad as saying that the U.S. should sanction Israel. I mean that's the that's the equivalent of this if you
political
know the
heresy.
Yes, the boycott and divestment, where it has actually been made illegal in parts of the U.S.
Lots of parts
to boycott Israel, right? And it to suggest as a politician that Israel is anything less than
America's best friend in the Middle East.
Yeah. I mean, that is, politically verboten. It's a third rail in the United States. Yeah. Well, this is even more so, of course, in the new Ukraine, under the regime that seized power in 2014, and that continues up to this moment. And right now, Russian forces are continuing to move, again, not directly on the Ukrainian border. Ukraine actually has, or at least the Kiev regime has more forces directly on the border, some half of their military, at least 125,000 troops, than Russia does at what people say is somewhere between 70 and the upper estimates go up to 120. But if you actually read into all of the serious reports beyond the headlines and the salacious first paragraphs, even the Washington Post has admitted that there's some 70 to 90,000 Russian troops on the Ukrainian border, which is no different than what it has been since 2014 and the civil conflict there broke out. Right. But that 175,000 could be gathered in short notice. And but it's actually true, right? Yeah. To a degree.
Right.
But
so what?
That doesn't create the immediacy of the threatening headlines, and the scaremongering. So everything is talking about Russian troops massed on the Ukrainian border, ready as barbarian hordes to swoop in on this new brilliant pro-U.S. democracy, as they refer to it, which could not be further from the political truth about the regime in Kiev on the ground. But that is the propaganda narrative. That is the rhetoric, with very little reflection in actual reality. And like I said, I believe that Russia is considering a military intervention at this point. But the nuance, the details of it, they think that American listeners are very simple and need to be led around by the nose, and nuance and complicated arguments and are simply, something that would confuse the issue.
Well, that's true. Let me ask you something, by the way. I mean, you're from Pennsylvania.
CPR listeners.
Huh? No, of course not. You're from Pennsylvania, and you were in the U.S. military.
Originally, yes.
So you have a good idea of the geography and the population distribution and the infrastructure of the United States. How long would you estimate it would take for the U.S. to place 125,000 troops on the border with Canada or Mexico?
That's a good question. It would take probably, upwards of a week.
Yeah.
Simply because the U.S. has so much of their military forces stationed overseas.
Abroad, yeah, right.
In other
They'd have
countries.
to draft people first. That's right.
Yeah, they would have to call up National Guard and reservists.
Right.
So I don't think they would have to draft people, but 100,000 troops is pretty significant. And the U.S. is simply look at the U.S. has two, what have always been militarily weak neighbors, right? Canada and Mexico,
right.
and they have the Monroe Doctrine, where all of the Western Hemisphere is regarded as their sphere of influence. And if you want to think that that's ancient history, you only had to look at statements by Rex Tillerson and John Bolton in the last administration saying the Monroe Doctrine is very much alive and well.
Yep.
And just recently, at suggestions from the press that Russia may seek to reopen military bases in Cuba or establish them in Venezuela, the response from the White House was, well, if that was the case, we would take decisive action.
Yeah.
Because we have an entire hemisphere as our immediate first layer sphere of influence, and the entire world as our second or third layer sphere of influence.
Occupied,
but
basically.
Russia is not allowed any sphere of influence.
That's
right?
No, not even inside Russia. That's what they're doing. And we got about
not even inside Russia, evidently. Yeah.
We got about 30 seconds. What would you say, looking over the next week or so after looking at the UN yesterday, is going to happen next? And now we got about 20 seconds.
So China full-throatedly supported Russia at the UN. I expect the tensions to continue. I expect a slow Russian military buildup. Russia will formally respond to the U.S. reply to their security guarantees, but I think that is kind of politically stalling at this point. I think things are being set in motion, and Russia has either got to back down at this point from their military buildup or act on it.
Mark, thank you very much. I hope it's some third outcome, and we'll speak again next week, hopefully. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me.
And that's all the news we have for you right now. For Community Public Radio, I'm Don DeBar in New York. Thanks for listening.